This document presents a comprehensive analysis of what has become known as the classroom incident, a previously classified encounter between an advanced alien reconnaissance force and Professor Elena Vasquez, an educator specializing in human psychological development and strategic thinking. The incident, which occurred at Terra Nova University on the outer rim colony of Kepler 442b, represents one of the most significant demonstrations of human adaptability and strategic innovation in the face of overwhelming technological disadvantage. The aliens, later identified as members of the Zethkari collective, possessed technology centuries beyond human capability. Their initial assessment classified humans as primitive bipedal organisms with limited cognitive capacity. This assessment would prove catastrophically incorrect. Professor Vasquez, armed with nothing more than her understanding of human psychology and the principles she had spent decades teaching, not only repelled the invasion force but fundamentally altered their species' perception of humanity. The psychological principles demonstrated in this incident center around the core human philosophy that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This document examines how Professor Vasquez embodied this principle, transforming what appeared to be humanity's greatest weakness, our emotional volatility and unpredictable nature, into our most formidable weapon. Part 1. The Invasion the morning of 2387-0122 began like any other at Terra Nova University. Professor Elena Vasquez was conducting her weekly seminar on psychological resilience and strategic adaptation to a class of 37 graduate students. The subject matter, focusing on how humans overcome adversity through mental restructuring and strategic thinking, would prove prophetically relevant within hours. At precisely 10:47 local time, the university's atmospheric sensors detected anomalous energy signatures. The readings were unlike anything in the colonial database, coherent energy patterns suggesting technology far beyond human achievement. Dr. James Chen, the university's xenobiology professor, initially dismissed the readings as equipment malfunction. The idea that alien technology could penetrate the sector's early warning systems seemed impossible. Professor Vasquez was in the middle of explaining the psychological concept of controlled demolition of limiting beliefs when the classroom's environmental systems began fluctuating. The lights dimmed, then brightened beyond normal parameters. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 seconds. Most unsettling of all, a low-frequency vibration began emanating from the walls themselves. "Professor," called out Marcus Webb, one of her more attentive students, "the air feels different. Like before a thunderstorm, but wrong somehow." Vasquez paused her lecture, her instincts honed by years of studying human behavioral patterns under stress. The students were displaying classic pre-panic indicators: rapid eye movements, unconscious clustering behavior, elevated breathing patterns. But something else was happening. Something that would later prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. The classroom door, constructed of standard colonial titanium steel composite, began to glow with an ethereal blue light. The glow intensified, and the metal started to dissolve, not melting or burning, but simply ceasing to exist at a molecular level. Through the expanding aperture stepped beings that challenged every assumption humans had made about extraterrestrial life. The Zethkari were not the stereotypical greys of ancient Earth folklore, nor were they the insectoid monstrosities depicted in colonial fiction. They stood approximately 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs that moved with disturbing fluidity. Their skin appeared to be composed of a semi-translucent material that shifted between silver and deep purple depending on the viewing angle. Most disconcerting were their faces, if they could be called faces. Where humans had features, the Zethkari had smooth, curved surfaces punctuated by clusters of sensory organs that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. 3 of them entered the classroom, moving with the calculated precision of apex predators. In their hands, though hands was an inadequate description for the branching, multi-jointed appendages, they carried devices that hummed with barely contained energy. The students recoiled instinctively. But Professor Vasquez remained at her podium, her mind racing through decades of accumulated knowledge about human psychology under extreme stress. The lead Zethkari spoke, though spoke implied a vocal mechanism they clearly did not possess. Instead, words formed directly in the minds of everyone present, accompanied by waves of alien emotion that felt like ice water flowing through neural pathways. "We are the Zethkari. You are specimens of the species designated as human. Your cognitive development has reached the threshold where sampling is required. Resistance is not merely futile, it is incomprehensible. Your species lacks the neural architecture for effective opposition. The message was delivered with the casual indifference of a researcher addressing laboratory animals. The students were paralyzed, caught between the human fight-or-flight response and the complete absence of viable options. Several began to hyperventilate. 2 fainted outright. But Professor Vasquez was thinking. In that moment of absolute terror, as alien minds invaded her consciousness and revealed the vast gulf between human and Zethkari capability, she did something that would later be studied by military strategists across human space. She began to dismantle her own fear. The technique she employed was one she had taught for years but never tested under such extreme circumstances. She called it psychological archaeology, the systematic excavation and examination of one's own mental responses under stress. Instead of fighting the terror, she embraced it, analyzed it, and began to understand it not as weakness but as raw material for strategic advantage. Students, she said, her voice carrying with preternatural calm, this is an unprecedented opportunity to observe the principles we've been studying in real-time application. Note your physiological responses. Examine your cognitive patterns. What assumptions are you making about this situation? The Zethkari leaders' sensory organs pulsed with what might have been confusion. In their exploration of 17 different species across the galaxy, they had never encountered a reaction quite like this. Most species either fled in panic or attacked in desperate fury. Some attempted negotiation or submission. None had ever treated first contact as an educational experience. The primary specimen displays anomalous behavioral patterns, the alien communicated to its companions. Recommended procedure indicates immediate neural sampling to determine if this represents a new form of cognitive dysfunction. Professor Vasquez heard the mental communication. The Zethkari made no attempt to shield their thoughts from what they considered inferior minds. This oversight would prove to be the first crack in their seemingly insurmountable advantage. But more importantly, it gave her insight into how they perceived the situation, as researchers encountering an unexpected variable in an otherwise routine procedure. Class, she continued, beginning to pace in front of the podium, with the same measured steps she used during her most challenging lectures. What we're witnessing is a perfect example of the principle we discussed last week. Remember the quote from Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Student Sarah Chen, despite her terror, found herself responding to the familiar rhythms of academic discourse. Professor, are you suggesting we can somehow think our way out of this? Not think our way out, Vasquez replied, her eyes never leaving the aliens who were now observing her with what appeared to be scientific curiosity. Transform our way through. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Our weak selves are the ones who see only two options, submission or futile resistance. The lead Zethkari moved closer, its sensory organs now pulsing in rapid, complex patterns. This specimen's neural activity is unlike previous samples. The fear response is present but appears to be undergoing real-time modification through conscious intervention. What the alien was observing, though it lacked the framework to understand it, was the fundamental human capacity for psychological metamorphosis under extreme pressure. Professor Vasquez was not suppressing her fear. She was weaponizing it. Every surge of adrenaline, every spike of terror was being channeled into heightened awareness and strategic clarity. The weakness we must destroy, she explained to her students while simultaneously studying every detail of the alien's behavior, is the assumption that we are powerless. Power is not about superior technology or physical capability. Power is about understanding the nature of the game being played and refusing to accept the rules as immutable. The second Zethkari, positioned near the windows that offered a view of the university courtyard, emitted a series of harmonic frequencies that translated as urgent communication. Neural sampling of the primary specimen should proceed immediately. Its behavioral patterns are deviating beyond acceptable parameters for routine collection. But the leader was hesitating, a reaction that would have shocked its fellow collective members if they had been present. In 17 previous species encounters, the Zethkari had never experienced uncertainty. Their technological superiority was so overwhelming, their understanding of cognitive patterns so comprehensive that every previous first contact had proceeded according to established protocols. Professor Vasquez sensed this hesitation and recognized it for what it was, the first sign that the alien's certainty was not as absolute as they projected. She filed this observation away while continuing her peculiar form of resistance. "Let me ask you something," she said, addressing the lead alien directly. The students gasped. Speaking to the invaders seemed like madness. "You've studied other species. How many of them treated your arrival as a learning experience rather than a crisis?" The question penetrated the alien's consciousness in a way that purely human communication should not have been able to achieve. The Zethkari communicated through direct neural interface, but Professor Vasquez had somehow managed to imbue her spoken words with psychological pressure that registered even in an alien mind. "No previous species has displayed this response pattern," the alien admitted, its mental voice carrying undertones that might have been frustration. "Your behavior does not conform to established models of pre-sapient cognitive architecture." "Pre-sapient," Vasquez repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting assumption." "You've decided we're not fully intelligent because we don't match your cognitive template. That's a remarkably limiting worldview for such an advanced species." The third alien, which had remained near the dissolved doorway, now moved deeper into the room. Its communication was sharp with urgency. "This interaction has exceeded acceptable parameters. The specimen is demonstrating cognitive patterns that may indicate defensive capability beyond initial assessment." What the Zethkari were experiencing, though they lacked the conceptual framework to understand it, was the uniquely human phenomenon of psychological jujitsu, the ability to use an opponent's strength against them. Every assumption they made about human cognitive limitations became a weapon in Professor Vasquez's growing arsenal. She began to walk among her students, her movements deliberate and confident. "Class, observe how our visitors are communicating. Note the increasing urgency in their exchanges. What does this tell us about their emotional state?" "They're uncertain?" ventured David Park, one of her doctoral candidates. "Exactly. And uncertainty in a species that considers itself cognitively superior is a profound psychological vulnerability. They've built their entire approach on the assumption of predictability. When that assumption fails, their entire decision-making framework becomes compromised. The lead Zethkari's sensory organs were now pulsing in rapid, chaotic patterns that would have been recognizable to any human observer as agitation. Specimen continues to demonstrate anomalous cognitive patterns. Behavioral modification through standard intimidation protocols has failed. Neural sampling must proceed despite irregular parameters, but even as it communicated this decision, the alien was experiencing something it had never encountered before: doubt. The human's behavior was so far outside established patterns that it raised uncomfortable questions about the collective's fundamental assumptions regarding lesser species. Professor Vasquez sensed this growing uncertainty and pressed her psychological advantage. "You know what I find fascinating?" she said, her tone conversational despite the circumstances. "You've developed technology that can dissolve matter at the molecular level, but you're still approaching this interaction using the same basic pattern you'd use with any other species. That suggests a profound lack of adaptability in your thinking." The observation struck with surgical precision at a core vulnerability the Zethkari didn't know they possessed. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of technological superiority enabling psychological dominance. The idea that their approach might be fundamentally flawed was not merely disturbing, it was cognitively destabilizing. "Your assessment is incorrect," the leader responded, but the mental undertones carried a defensiveness that had been absent from its previous communications. "The collective's protocols are based on comprehensive analysis of cognitive patterns across 17 species. Your behavioral anomalies do not invalidate established methodologies." 17 species, Vasquez mused. "And how many of those species are still independent after their encounter with the collective?" The silence that followed was profound. The students who had been following the exchange with growing fascination despite their terror began to understand what their professor was doing. She wasn't just buying time or making conversation. She was systematically dismantling the psychological foundation of the alien sense of superiority. The second Zethkari moved to flank Professor Vasquez, its weapon, a device that resembled crystalline lightning frozen in geometric form, humming with increased energy. Specimen demonstrates dangerous cognitive patterns. Immediate neural sampling is required to prevent further psychological contamination of the local population. But Professor Vasquez was already moving to her next phase of psychological warfare. "Contamination," she repeated. "You're afraid that our way of thinking might spread. That tells me something very important about your species." she turned to face all three aliens simultaneously, a feat that should have been impossible, but which she accomplished through careful positioning and the use of reflective surfaces throughout the classroom. You're not just technologically advanced, you're psychologically fragile. Your entire sense of identity depends on maintaining cognitive superiority over other species. The moment that superiority is questioned, your confidence begins to crumble. The accuracy of this assessment sent shockwaves through the Zethkari's collective consciousness. For a species that communicated through direct neural interface, emotional states were impossible to hide. The growing uncertainty, confusion, and yes, fear that Professor Vasquez's words had triggered was immediately apparent to all three aliens. The lead Zethkari raised its weapon, the crystalline structure now blazing with energy that made the air itself shimmer. Cognitive assessment complete. Specimen represents unprecedented psychological threat to collective stability. Immediate termination authorized. But as the weapon powered up, something extraordinary happened. Professor Vasquez smiled. Part 2. The Transformation. The smile that crossed Professor Vasquez's face was not one of desperation or madness, as the Zethkari might have expected. It was the smile of a teacher who had just watched a particularly slow student finally grasp a crucial concept. The aliens, despite their advanced technology and supposed cognitive superiority, had just made the most predictable mistake possible. They had revealed their primary weakness. "There it is," she said softly, her voice carrying to every corner of the classroom despite its low volume. A moment when superior technology becomes a crutch for inferior thinking. The lead Zethkari hesitated, its weapon still charged but no longer aimed directly at her. The pause was infinitesimal by human standards, but for a species that communicated at the speed of thought, it represented a massive cognitive disruption. "Explain the meaning of your statement."
"You've just told me everything I need to know about your species,"
Professor Vasquez replied, beginning to move again with the same measured pace she used during her most complex lectures. When faced with something that challenges your worldview, your immediate response is elimination rather than understanding. That's not the behavior of a superior intelligence. It's the behavior of a threatened one. The psychological pressure of this observation was so intense that it registered across all three aliens simultaneously. Their sensory organs began pulsing in synchronized patterns that spoke of deep distress. For a species that had built its entire identity around cognitive supremacy, the suggestion that they were acting from a position of weakness was more devastating than any physical attack could have been. Student Marcus Webb, who had been watching the exchange with growing understanding, suddenly spoke up. "Professor, they're showing classic defensive behavior patterns, aren't they? The same ones we studied in the unit on organizational psychology under threat?" "Excellent observation, Marcus," Vasquez replied without taking her eyes off the aliens. "What we're witnessing is a perfect example of what happens when a rigid hierarchical system encounters genuine novelty. Unable to process the new information through existing frameworks, the system defaults to elimination protocols. The second Zethkari moved to support its leader, but its movements were no longer fluid and confident. The specimen's psychological manipulation techniques are more sophisticated than initial assessment indicated. Recommend immediate withdrawal and orbital bombardment of the facility. This communication, intended to be private between the aliens, was nonetheless detected by Professor Vasquez's increasingly acute awareness. The suggestion of orbital bombardment told her two crucial things. First, that the aliens were becoming genuinely afraid of her psychological assault, and second, that they were considering escalation to a level that would eliminate any possibility of learning from the encounter. "You're thinking about orbital bombardment," she said casually, causing all three aliens to freeze. "That confirms my assessment. You're so threatened by the possibility that your cognitive models might be wrong that you'd rather destroy the evidence than examine it." The fact that she had somehow intercepted their private communications sent another shockwave through the Zethkari's consciousness. Their technology was supposed to be secure from primitive human detection. The possibility that Professor Vasquez had developed some form of psychic ability was terrifying, but the truth was even more disturbing. She was reading their emotional states with such precision that she could predict their strategic decisions. "How are you intercepting our communications?" the leader demanded, its weapon now wavering as confusion overtook aggressive intent. Professor Vasquez laughed, a sound so genuinely amused that it seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. "I'm not intercepting anything. I'm just paying attention. Your body language, the patterns of your sensory organs, the emotional undertones in your mental voice, You're broadcasting your thoughts as clearly as if you were speaking them aloud. She turned to her students, who were now watching the exchange with fascination rather than terror. Class, what are we observing here? The aliens have technology that can dissolve matter and communicate through direct neural interface, but what critical skill are they lacking? Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively. Emotional intelligence? The ability to read and interpret nonverbal communication? Precisely. They've become so dependent on their technology for communication that they've lost the ability to recognize when others are reading their emotional states through more primitive means. It's a perfect example of how advancement in one area can create vulnerabilities in another. The third Zethkari, which had been silent throughout most of the exchange, now stepped forward. Its communication was different from the others, more complex, carrying undertones that suggested a different role within their hierarchy. The specimen's analytical capabilities suggest possible elevation beyond pre-sapient status. Recommend revision of initial assessment protocols. This was the first crack in the aliens' unified position, and Professor Vasquez immediately recognized its significance. One of them was beginning to question the fundamental assumptions that had guided their approach. She filed this information away while preparing to exploit the emerging division in their ranks. "Your colleague is beginning to understand something important," she said, addressing the leader while keeping the third alien in her peripheral vision. "The question is whether your species is capable of learning, or whether rigid adherence to established protocols will prevent you from adapting to new information." The challenge was carefully constructed to exploit the growing tension between the aliens. The leader was invested in maintaining the validity of existing procedures, while the third alien was beginning to recognize that those procedures might be inadequate for dealing with humans. Collective protocols are based on comprehensive analysis of cognitive patterns across multiple species, the leader replied. But its mental voice now carried defensive undertones that had been absent at the beginning of the encounter. Anomalous behavior by a single specimen does not justify systemic revision. Single specimen, Professor Vasquez repeated thoughtfully. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not an anomaly. I'm a representative example. Every human in this room is capable of the same psychological flexibility you're witnessing." To demonstrate this point, she turned to her students. "Class, I want you to think about this situation from the aliens' perspective. They've encountered 17 other species, all of which responded to first contact in predictable ways. Now they're facing something completely outside their experience. How might that affect their confidence in their own capabilities?" The students, who had been gradually adapting to the surreal nature of the situation, began to engage with the problem as they would any other academic challenge. The transformation was remarkable. Fear was being replaced by curiosity, panic by analytical thinking. "They're probably questioning their entire assessment methodology," offered David Park. "If humans don't fit their models, maybe the models are incomplete." "It goes deeper than that," added Maria Santos, one of the psychology graduate students. "They've built their entire sense of species superiority on the assumption that they understand how intelligence works. We're challenging that fundamental assumption." The effect of this analysis on the Zethkari was profound. They were listening to a classroom full of beings they had dismissed as pre-sapient engage in sophisticated psychological analysis of their own cognitive limitations. The disconnect between their initial assessment and the observable reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The third alien moved closer to Professor Vasquez, its weapon lowered though still active. "Your species demonstrates cognitive capabilities that were not detected in preliminary surveys. This discrepancy requires investigation." "Now you're asking the right questions," Vasquez replied approvingly. "The discrepancy exists because your preliminary surveys were based on flawed assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself." She began to pace again, her movements now incorporating subtle elements of theatrical presentation that held the attention of both students and aliens alike. "You've been measuring intelligence as if it were a static property, like mass or electrical charge. But human intelligence is dynamic, adaptive, contextual. We become more intelligent in response to challenges." This observation struck at another fundamental assumption underlying Zethkari civilization. Their own intelligence was indeed relatively static. Individuals were born with fixed cognitive capabilities that changed little throughout their lifespans. The idea that intelligence could be enhanced through adversity was not merely foreign to them, it was conceptually revolutionary. Dynamic intelligence. The third alien repeated, its communication patterns now showing signs of genuine scientific curiosity. This would explain the discrepancy between survey data and observed capabilities. Professor Vasquez sensed the shift in the alien's attitude, and pressed her advantage. You want to understand humans? Then you need to understand this. We're not the same species in times of peace that we are in times of crisis. Challenge us, threaten us, push us to our limits, and we become something more than we were before. She gestured to her students, who were indeed displaying capabilities that would have been impossible to predict from their normal classroom behavior. Look at them. 2 hours ago, they were typical graduate students. Now they're conducting real-time psychological analysis of an alien species while maintaining functional behavior under extreme stress. That's not despite their fear, it's because of it. The lead Zethkari's weapon powered down slightly as the implications of this statement penetrated its consciousness. You are suggesting that stress enhances rather than degrades cognitive performance? For humans, yes. Within limits, stress triggers evolutionary adaptations that have been refined over millions of years. We literally become more intelligent when we're challenged. This was the key insight that would later revolutionize Zethkari understanding of biological intelligence. Their own species had evolved in a relatively stable environment where cognitive consistency was more valuable than adaptability. The concept of intelligence that improved under pressure was not just alien to them. It represented a completely different approach to evolutionary development. The second alien, which had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the exchange, suddenly raised its weapon to full power. Enough analysis. The specimens represent a clear threat to collective stability. Termination protocols will proceed regardless of cognitive anomalies. But as it prepared to fire, something unprecedented happened. Professor Vasquez stepped forward, directly into the weapon's targeting range, her students moving to flank her in a formation that had developed spontaneously without any verbal coordination. Go ahead, she said quietly. Prove my point. The alien hesitated, its weapon wavering. Explain. You came here believing you were the apex predators of the galaxy. Faced with evidence that contradicts that belief, your immediate response is to destroy the evidence rather than learn from it. That's not the behavior of a superior species. It's the behavior of a frightened one. The psychological pressure of this challenge was immense. By stepping into the line of fire, Professor Vasquez had transformed the situation from one where the aliens held all the power to one where their next action would define the entire encounter. Killing her would prove her point about their psychological fragility. Backing down would acknowledge her intellectual superiority. The third alien moved between its colleague and the humans, its own weapon now aimed at the second Zethkari. Termination is not authorized without collective consensus. The situation requires comprehensive analysis before action is taken. For the first time since the encounter began, the aliens were in direct conflict with each other. The psychological pressure that Professor Vasquez had been systematically building had finally fractured their unified front. The students watched in fascination as superior technology became secondary to the internal struggle between competing interpretations of the situation. Your species is fracturing, Vasquez observed with clinical precision. The same rigid thinking that gave you confidence in your superiority is now preventing you from adapting to new information. You're trapped by your own success. The lead alien's sensory organs were now pulsing in chaotic patterns that spoke of profound cognitive distress. The specimen's psychological manipulation has exceeded acceptable parameters. Collective stability requires immediate intervention. But even as it said this, the alien was beginning to understand the trap it had walked into. Any action it took now would validate Professor Vasquez's analysis of their psychological limitations. The only way to maintain their sense of superiority was to admit that she was right about their inability to adapt. Professor Vasquez sensed this growing understanding and prepared to deliver the final element of her psychological assault. You want to know the difference between your species and mine? When we encounter something that challenges our understanding, we don't try to destroy it. We try to learn from it. That's why we'll ultimately surpass you, no matter how advanced your technology becomes. The statement was delivered with such quiet confidence that it penetrated even the most rigid Zethkari consciousness. Here was a member of a supposedly primitive species, facing 3 technologically superior beings capable of destroying her without effort, calmly predicting the eventual dominance of her kind. The specimen demonstrates cognitive patterns consistent with advanced strategic thinking. The third alien observed, its communication now carrying undertones of respect that would have been impossible to imagine at the beginning of the encounter. Recommend full reassessment of human cognitive capabilities. The lead alien's weapon powered down completely as the implications of the situation became clear. They had entered the classroom expecting to conduct routine specimen collection on a pre-sapient species. Instead, they had encountered something that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about intelligence, evolution, and their own place in the cosmic hierarchy. This encounter will require collective analysis, it admitted, the words carrying undertones of defeat that were unmistakable even to human ears. Current protocols are inadequate for species displaying dynamic cognitive enhancement under stress. Professor Vasquez smiled again, but this time it was the smile of a teacher who had successfully guided students through a particularly challenging lesson. Now you're beginning to understand. The question is, what are you going to do with this understanding? Part 3. The Revelation. The transformation that had occurred in the classroom was profound, but Professor Vasquez understood that the most critical phase of the encounter was just beginning. She had successfully destabilized the aliens' psychological framework and forced them to question their fundamental assumptions, but the long-term implications of this moment would depend on what happened next. The third Zethkari, which had emerged as the most psychologically flexible of the group, moved to the center of the room. Its communication patterns had evolved throughout the encounter, becoming more complex and nuanced as it adapted to the unprecedented situation. The cognitive patterns demonstrated by this human collective suggest that our entire assessment of intelligence requires revision. This has implications beyond this single encounter. Professor Vasquez recognized the significance of this statement. The alien wasn't just acknowledging that humans were more intelligent than initially assessed. It was beginning to question the collective's approach to intelligence evaluation across all species. This was the opening she had been working toward throughout the entire encounter. "What you're discovering," she said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used for her most important lectures, "is that intelligence isn't a single characteristic that can be measured and categorized. It's a complex adaptive system that responds to environmental pressures. Every species you've encountered has probably demonstrated forms of intelligence that your assessment protocols failed to recognize." The implications of this observation sent shockwaves through all three aliens simultaneously. If humans could demonstrate capabilities that exceeded initial assessment, what about the other 17 species the collective had encountered? How many potentially valuable perspectives had been dismissed because they didn't conform to Zethkari cognitive models? The lead alien, its earlier certainty now completely eroded, struggled to process this possibility. "Are you suggesting that our entire approach to interspecies contact has been flawed?" "I'm suggesting that any species advanced enough to develop interstellar travel should be sophisticated enough to recognize that intelligence takes many forms," Professor Vasquez replied. "The fact that you didn't anticipate this possibility suggests that your own intelligence, while certainly advanced, may be more limited than you realized." She began to walk among her students, who were now watching the exchange with the focused attention they normally reserved for final examinations. "Class, what we're witnessing is a perfect example of the principle we discussed at the beginning of the semester. Remember the concept of cognitive humility? The recognition that our understanding is always incomplete and subject to revision?" Student Marcus Webb nodded thoughtfully. "The aliens developed their superiority complex because they never encountered a species that challenged their models effectively. But that doesn't mean those species weren't intelligent. They just expressed their intelligence differently. And now our visitors are experiencing what happens when cognitive humility is forced upon a consciousness that has never had to exercise it before." The second Zethkari, which had been the most aggressive throughout the encounter, was now displaying behavior patterns that could only be described as contemplative. Its weapon remained powered but was no longer aimed at any of the humans. "If our assessment protocols have been inadequate, then our interactions with other species may have been suboptimal." Professor Vasquez sensed that this was the moment to introduce the most challenging concept of all. Suboptimal is one way to put it. Another way would be to acknowledge that you may have systematically underestimated and potentially harmed 17 different species because you were too rigid to recognize their value. The psychological impact of this statement was devastating. The Zethkari had built their entire civilization on the principle of benevolent superiority. They genuinely believed they were helping lesser species by bringing them under collective protection. The possibility that they had been systematically oppressing forms of intelligence they were too limited to recognize was a crisis that struck at the core of their cultural identity. The third alien moved closer to Professor Vasquez, its sensory organs now pulsing in patterns that suggested intense concentration. "Your species possesses cognitive capabilities that our models cannot adequately describe. This suggests that direct neural interface may be required to fully understand your thought processes." Neural interface, Vasquez repeated thoughtfully. You want to connect your mind directly to mine? It would be the most efficient method for comprehensive cognitive mapping, the alien confirmed. Professor Vasquez considered this proposal carefully. The opportunity to establish direct mental contact with an alien intelligence was unprecedented, but it also represented significant risk. However, her analysis of the situation suggested that this might be the key to achieving something far more significant than mere survival. I'll agree to neural interface on one condition, she said finally. The connection must be bidirectional. If you're going to examine my cognitive patterns, I get to examine yours. The three aliens exchanged rapid communications, their mental voices carrying undertones of excitement, apprehension, and curiosity in roughly equal measure. The concept of allowing a supposedly primitive being access to Zethkari consciousness was unprecedented, but the potential insights to be gained were too valuable to ignore. Bidirectional interface carries significant risks, the lead alien warned. Your cognitive architecture may not be compatible with collective consciousness protocols. Then we'll find out together, Professor Vasquez replied. That's what learning actually means. Accepting uncertainty and proceeding anyway. The students watched in fascination as their professor prepared to undertake what might be the most dangerous experiment in human history, but they had learned throughout the encounter to trust her strategic thinking, and her confidence was infectious. Professor, Sarah Chen called out, what should we do if something goes wrong? Vasquez turned to address her students one final time before the neural interface began. Remember everything we've discussed today. Remember that intelligence is adaptive, that challenge makes us stronger, and that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. If something happens to me, use what you've learned. Show them what humans are really capable of. The third alien approached her with a device that resembled crystallized starlight formed into geometric patterns. Neural interface will commence on your acknowledgement. Warning. The process may result in permanent alteration of consciousness for both participants. Professor Vasquez nodded her understanding. I've been permanently altering consciousness for 30 years. It's called teaching. As the device made contact with her temples, Professor Vasquez felt her awareness expand in ways that challenged every assumption she had ever made about the nature of consciousness itself. The Zethkari mind that connected with hers was vast, ancient, and structured in patterns that were simultaneously beautiful and alien. But what shocked her most was not the differences between human and alien consciousness. It was the similarities. Beneath the technological sophistication and the crystalline logic patterns, she found something remarkably familiar. Curiosity, fear, hope, and the desire to understand one's place in the universe. The alien experiencing the connection was undergoing an equally profound revelation. Professor Vasquez's mind was nothing like the collective's models had predicted. Instead of the chaotic, emotion-driven patterns they expected from a primitive species, they found a consciousness that was organized, purposeful, and extraordinarily adaptive. More significantly, they discovered that human intelligence operated on principles that the collective had never encountered. Where Zethkari thought in linear progressions and hierarchical structures, human consciousness functioned as a dynamic network that could reorganize itself in real time in response to new challenges. This is extraordinary. The alien's thoughts flowed directly into Professor Vasquez's awareness. Your cognitive patterns are not inferior to ours. They're completely different. It's as if we'd been comparing a crystal to a river and declaring the crystal superior because it holds its shape. Professor Vasquez allowed her own thoughts to flow back through the connection. And what you're discovering is that rivers can carve through mountains given enough time. Different doesn't mean inferior. It means complementary. As the neural interface deepened, both participants began to experience something unprecedented. True interspecies understanding. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable at the beginning of the encounter dissolved as two radically different forms of consciousness found common ground in their shared desire to learn and grow. The other two Zethkari watched in amazement as their colleagues' consciousness underwent rapid transformation. The rigid thought patterns that had characterized their species for millennia began to show signs of the same adaptive flexibility they were observing in the human mind. The interface is causing cognitive evolution in real time, the second alien observed, its earlier regression replaced by scientific fascination. Both participants are becoming something more than they were individually. Professor Vasquez was experiencing the same phenomenon from the inside. Her human intuition and adaptive thinking were being enhanced by access to the aliens' vast knowledge base and logical processing capabilities. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand the true implications of what had occurred in the classroom. You need to understand something. She communicated through the neural link, her thoughts now carrying the enhanced clarity that came from hybrid consciousness. What happened here today wasn't about humans defeating aliens. It was about the universe becoming more than it was before. The concept flowed through the connection and into the aliens' awareness with crystalline clarity. The encounter hadn't been a victory of one species over another. It had been the birth of something entirely new. The combination of human adaptability and Zethkari knowledge created possibilities that neither species could have achieved alone. As the neural interface reached full integration, Professor Vasquez made a discovery that would change the course of galactic civilization. The Zethkari weren't conquerors or even benevolent protectors. They were searchers. Their entire culture was built around a desperate need to find something that would give meaning to their vast but emotionally empty existence. You're lonely, she realized, the understanding flowing through the connection like water finding its level. Your entire species is cosmically lonely. All that technology, all that knowledge, and you've never found another species that could truly understand you. The alien's consciousness recoiled at first, then slowly acknowledged the truth of her observation. We have sought comprehension across 17 species and found only lesser versions of ourselves. We began to believe that true understanding was impossible. But it's not impossible, Professor Vasquez replied, her human warmth beginning to flow through the alien consciousness like sunlight through crystal. It just requires something you've never tried before, true partnership rather than domination. The revelation was transformative for both species. Humans offered what the Zethkari had been seeking for millennia, not another version of their own consciousness, but a completely different way of experiencing reality that could complement and enhance their own capabilities. The Zethkari offered humans access to technologies and knowledge that could accelerate their development by thousands of years. But more than that, they offered each other something that neither species had ever experienced before: true interspecies friendship based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than dominance and submission. As the neural interface began to separate, both participants found themselves fundamentally changed by the experience. Professor Vasquez retained enhanced cognitive capabilities that would serve her well in the years to come, while the alien had gained something even more valuable: the ability to experience the universe through completely different perspectives. The third alien turned to its companions, its communication now carrying harmonics that had never been heard in Zethkari discourse before. We must return to the collective with this information. Our entire approach to interspecies relations requires immediate revision. More than revision, the lead alien replied, its own consciousness now showing signs of the same adaptive flexibility. What we have discovered here suggests the possibility of genuine galactic cooperation rather than benevolent hegemony. Professor Vasquez stepped back from the neural interface device, her human consciousness once again separate but permanently enhanced by the experience. Her students watched in amazement as she turned to face them with eyes that held depths of understanding that hadn't been there before. Class dismissed, she said with a smile that carried the warmth of two species learning to see the universe through each other's eyes. I think we've covered enough material for one day. But as the aliens prepared to leave, the lead Zethkari paused at the threshold where the door had once stood. Professor Vasquez, your species will be contacted again. But next time it will be as equals seeking mutual understanding, rather than superiors collecting specimens. And next time, she replied, we'll be ready to teach you a few more things about what intelligence really means. As the aliens departed, their ships rising silently into the colonial sky, Professor Vasquez turned to her students one final time. Remember what you learned here today. Remember that the strongest person isn't the one who never falls down. It's the one who gets back up every time, learns from the experience, and becomes stronger than before. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he becomes something that grows stronger from every challenge, something that turns every obstacle into an opportunity for growth. That's not just a philosophy. It's the secret of human survival in a universe full of beings who think they're superior to us. The students filed out of the classroom, their minds reeling from everything they had witnessed. They had entered that morning as graduate students studying psychological resilience. They were leaving as witnesses to the first successful diplomatic contact between humans and an alien species. But Professor Vasquez remained behind. staring out the window at the fading lights of the alien ships. She knew that this encounter was just the beginning. The universe had just become a much larger and more interesting place, and humanity's real education was about to begin. The psychological principles that had saved her life and potentially altered the course of galactic civilization were the same ones she had been teaching for decades. The power to transform weakness into strength, to turn adversity into opportunity, to grow stronger through challenge rather than being broken by it. These were not just human characteristics. They were the fundamental principles of conscious evolution itself. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Professor Vasquez reflected on the day's events. She had destroyed her weak self, the frightened teacher who had faced impossible odds with nothing but her understanding of human psychology. In its place, she had become something new, a bridge between species, a translator of consciousness, and proof that intelligence truly is limited only by the courage to grow beyond one's current limitations. The universe was full of beings who thought they knew what intelligence looked like. Today, humanity had shown them something different. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work of showing them something better. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because in destroying that weakness, he becomes something that no external force can diminish. Professor Elena Vasquez had proven that principle not just for herself, but for her entire species. And in doing so, she had given humanity its first real chance to take its place as an equal partner in a galactic community that was about to discover what cooperation truly meant. Document classification. OMEGA. 7 distribution. Inevitably senior command only addendum. The psychological principles demonstrated in this encounter have been incorporated into standard diplomatic training protocols for all future alien contact scenarios. Professor Vasquez's techniques are now required study for all colonial defense personnel and diplomatic corps members. The war was won not with weapons but with wisdom, not through force but through understanding. The greatest victory is the one that transforms enemies into allies and conflicts into opportunities for mutual growth. End document.